Good afternoon. It's Thursday, the 8th of March 2018, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. Your host today, Mike Robinson, and myself, Brian Gerrish. We're also joined by Alex Thompson and David Ellis. And we're very lucky to be here, of course, because the Russians haven't got us, Mike.
Not yet. The hysteria just continues to get worse every second. And would you believe I have a problem here? Once again, that we had same problem on Monday.
Microphone.
Not the microphone, but I'm going to
Good afternoon. It's Thursday, the 8th of March 2018, and it's now 9 minutes past 1. Apologies, some technical problems there. So, your host today, Mike Robinson, Brian Gerrish, and we're delighted to be joined by Alex Thompson and David Ellis. We are very lucky to be back because, of course, those Russians are out there, Mike.
Absolutely. The Russians did not cause the technical problems with us this morning, but apparently they could cripple the UK. And my response to this, Brian, is I would hope so. Because honestly, if they're a major international power and they weren't capable of crippling the UK in its dire state at present, then really they've got bigger problems than we have. But anyway, the Daily Mail says Russian cyber attacks could cripple the UK, and this is according to so-called intelligence chiefs. They're saying that Kremlin agents have the capacity to shut down power supplies, hijack air traffic control, and disable air conditioning. Really? Disable air conditioning? Is that a critical infrastructure? Anyway, this is Sir Chris Deverell, who said that Russia is capable of crippling Britain, that Moscow doesn't care about civilian lives. And this, of course, follows on from the furore over the alleged poisoning of Sergei Skripal. And he and his daughter, of course, still in hospital.
Mike, that picture is just ridiculous on the Daily Mail. What does it say? It says there, the chilling scene in Salisbury yesterday. So somebody has supposedly, apparently, maybe used a chemical weapon or a biological weapon. The rest of Salisbury are walking around totally healthy before the incident, during the incident, after the incident, and then these people arrive here in their plastic suits, and we're all supposed to be terrified. It is utterly ridiculous, unbelievable.
Yes. Now, Alex Thompson, maybe it's a good time to bring you onto the programme. I saw something in the Telegraph yesterday, the day before, and I've seen it followed up today in other media, commenting that Sergei Skripal may have in fact been involved with Christopher Steele in some way. So there's that on the table, and certainly this seems to be a lot more to this Skripal story than the allegations that Russia has poisoned him. There's then the possibility that this is some kind of false flag on Britain's part to try to interfere with the Russian elections. Are we allowed to say that? Because I think it's only the Russians that interfere in elections in other countries, isn't it? But you have a story here suggesting odd British behaviour in the capital of the Urals, possibly involving the John Smith Trust.
Yes, or rather the same person, Laurie Bristow, the ambassador, our man in Moscow, has been involved in setting up both. Stalker Zone is the website there, which provides an accurate translation with hyperlink to the original Russian, describing how an eyewitness who wrote up this account that's been translated here saw Laurie Bristow, who's dining there with his wife, Mrs. Bristow, having breakfast at the same time, and how he went, despite the fact that we have a consulate in Yekaterinburg, Russia's third city, formerly known as Sverdlovsk. He just saw fit to go there in person to meet Yevgeny Roisman, the mayor. I know we're going to have comments about Jews because I've mentioned a Jewish name, but bear in mind, viewers, that Jews in Russia are as politically divided as they are anywhere else in the world, and there are pro and anti-Putin Jews. But this one happens to be Jewish. Yevgeny Roisman, the mayor of Yekaterinburg, was spotted having breakfast alone in the VIP section of this hotel, and he had a package which he exchanged for Ambassador Bristow's documents. Bristow was formerly our man in Baku, Azerbaijan. And there has been a history of our ambassadors in Azerbaijan working their way up higher because of the oil politics there and having close connections with the intelligence agencies. So Bristow is no exception. The link with the John Smith Trust is that just a month beforehand or so, the widow of John Smith, the former Labour Party leader of the mid-90s, was also in the city of Yekaterinburg, promoting the John Smith Trust in her late husband's knowledge. The John Smith Trust, as also covered on Stalker's own website, people can find it from there, has a wider Europe grant program for young specialists in Russia, the Caucasus, Europe and Central Asia. And it talks about getting Russians in place and talking with them about questions of leadership, social justice and the rule of law. So this is global Britain at its finest. There was an agreement when we opened our consulate in Yekaterinburg that we wouldn't use it for intelligence and the Russians wouldn't use the quid pro quo, which was their consulate in Edinburgh, for intelligence. MI5 was saying a decade ago the Russians were already breaking that. Well, what are we doing if not breaking that by going into a city which has a consul, sending the ambassador there anywhere, and dealing with the opposition favouring mayor and swapping documents with him just before regional elections?
So there's clearly lots going on here, lots more than's being reported in the mainstream media. I mean, what's your take on the Sergei Skripal story? Do you think are the potential links to the Christopher Steele dossier and Trump, are they credible? What's your view of the allegations that perhaps this is Britain attempting to meddle in Russian elections?
I have to be measured in what I say, but I'm getting a very clear picture now, Mike, that this goes back to a series of incidents in the early to mid-90s when a clique of then mid-ranking MI6 officers went dark and decided that it was going to control the Russia work, the Russia desk, and ultimately spin out into private consultancy doing the same. And I mean, I was at the heart of the Litvinenko case, obviously can't speak detail, but I will say that my boss, who had been very reliable on such matters, came back from a meeting with Steele once in the height of the Litvinenko inquiry and told me it was definite that the Russians did Litvinenko, and he would otherwise have told me the details, but in this case he just had a superior air of take it from me. And the man was never the same after that case. He went further and further away from his previous positions. I think there is a deep vein of plotting going on within some MI6 officers, and as they've gone out into other careers, involving having some jobs done like this and planting it on the Russians. Sorry to be so bald about this, but I can see it happening in a number of cases now.
Okay, thank you for that. Now, I'll just comment on the mainstream media continuing hysteria. Prince William won't be going to the World Cup in Russia, as a security expert says spies could poison team. So this is the Daily Mail again, hyping up this situation beyond all reasonableness. And also from the Mail, from foaming at the mouth to uncontrollable diarrhea and seizure. Here are the 10 terrifying ways nerve gas destroys the body within minutes. You know, what can we say about this? The mainstream media deserves all the criticism that they can get.
Well, because what's so easily ridiculous about this, Mike, is yes, this stuff can. It is so unbelievably dangerous in such absolutely minute quantities that it's very difficult to control. And even the military themselves in this country or America or Russia, whoever's got these sorts of weapons, knows that they are so unbelievably dangerous. You've got to have immense precautions in handling them at all times. I know of one gentleman who was present where there was a mistake in one of the tests at Porton Down. He then woke up in a hospital. He'd been there for 3 days. So to say that people are carrying little files of this stuff around to do people in on the streets, in my opinion, is utter nonsense.
That's the same Porton Down that's only a few miles away from where this incident is.
Indeed it is. Yes, it is.
Yes.
It is.
Yes, okay.
Well, this just is more of the story. At this very critical time when suddenly the whole of the UK government has switched to Russian bashing, up comes the BBC. We've got a journalist, Farida Rustamova, one of the BBC's own Russian journalists. She's come out and made an accusation of sexual harassment against Leonid Slutsky. He is denying it at the moment. Now, what's fascinating about this incident is that this lady said, well, it did happen. I recorded what he said, but it took place about 14 months ago. She hasn't done anything, it would appear, up until now, but at the exact moment that the British government's policy is blame everything on the Russians, in pops the BBC. And of course, it isn't just one, because they've teamed up with this lady. We've got Rustamova, and we've got this one, in fact, is it Katerina, sorry, I can't read it from here, Kotrikadze. And we've got another channel mentioned, TV Rain. So we've got this other lady journalist here. She also says this man tried to touch me up. And then we've got a mention of TV Rain.
Sorry, Alex, just let me ask, is the name Kotrikadze, is that a Georgian name?
Very well spotted, Mike. I was just putting in the chat room, we have here a Central Asian, I don't know the nationality off the top of my head, but probably Uzbek or Tajik. And we've got Yekaterina Kotrikadze is an ethnic Georgian in Russia. Otherwise, she'd have a slightly different Christian name. And Daria Zhuk, the third name there, is Ukrainian. So we have all the underbelly nations whose journalists are reframed by BBC in contexts like monitoring and media action, ganging up on Russia. There's been a long history of this.
Right, well, let me add another bit to that then. I'll bring this one in on screen, because when you go to look at TV Rain, and here's the overall director, Natalie Sindiva, it says in 2012 it broadcast live the mass protest meetings organised by the Democratic opposition. TV Rain is not afraid to invite to its studio critics of the Kremlin. So how opportune that the BBC can tune in on these women that claim they were sexually harassed. This can be pushed out to the British public at this critical time. But what do we find? That this is linked in with organisations buried inside Russia that are critical of the government. To me, the BBC reeks of subversion, but maybe I'm alone in that opinion.
Yeah, we'll talk more about that later on. Now, Alex, World War III, let's start off with this one. What shall we do with the Zumwalt sailors?
Yes, this is a riff on the old chorus, what shall we do with the drunken sailors? Brian has already been reporting, and David has in the past as well, on how the US Navy is having problems with its carrier fleet and not really knowing what kind of weaponry to put on these the decks of these massive boondoggle ships. Here we have the US Nuclear Posture Review talking openly about the idea of tactical nukes, nuclear cruise missiles, a concept that I don't think the West or the world has ever seen before, possibly being put on the deck of the new class, of which the Zumwalt's the first. This is the carrier that can't get through the Panama Canal and has problems in cold and hot water like our Type 45 destroyers, which are piddling by comparison. And to compare that with, I just put this on screen from War is Boring about the submarines of the future will be robotic once we've got it worked out, is the idea. So putting these together, I thought I'd throw it open to David, because we're seeing hints here, and some loose-lipped people around the British policy scene have been saying the same, that the British, Americans and French seem to be wanting to put their next generation of nuclear deterrent, on our side it will be a EU unified one, they seem to be wanting to put that in the surface carrier and destroyer class with escort ships, and use the subs basically for sneaky work with no nuclear deterrent in them, or if there is, then there'll be no men on board, which is extremely dangerous, of course, because then you have robotic decisions on launching nuclear ICBMs or undersea missiles. But it does seem that the idea of the nuclear deterrent going small and putting it on board destroyers is taking a bit of a lead now.
Well, welcome to the programme. David Ellis, what are your thoughts on that then?
Thank you, guys. Yeah, thanks, Alex. It dovetails in with some of the stuff that's going in American Naval Academy lectures currently about the cost ratios of defending, attacking against hypersonic missiles. So, and you've got all this Maghreb stuff as well that's kicking around, the energy weapons and the disruption or whatever. So you're coming back to a sort of protocol really on, look, if push comes to shove and you've got some kind of preemptive strike that's naval orientated, the stakes dictate that you would then have to escalate rapidly and preempt what the opposition are doing. And basically that means using nukes. So small tactical ones, the perception there is that they can get away with that publicly, and you're not having the body bags like we've seen in Korea and Vietnam and all the rest of it. So the dirty work will be done out there, and it will be done to an extent slightly remotely. Does dovetail with some of the intelligence that we've got from a former head of service talking about a new generation of very small, high potency EMP burst weaponry that's going on in our tube alloys, Los Alamos thing. So, yeah, I mean, that looks like that they're trying to find a way out of the hypersonic problem, and they're going to do it like this. Now, if that's the case, if they're going to start talking about nukes, I'm not sure how China, Russia, and the rest of them are going to react to that. They're not daft. They're not fooling. They're not, the Western Partnership won't be fooling them. They've got equally capable intelligence services that will know all about this. So the only people that are out of the loop are actually the British and American and European general public. they won't have any idea about this sort of thing. And it's really all this sideshow that we're seeing at the moment with all this propaganda is just to cover up all this very important stuff that's going on. Not just this, but obviously the unification of all the military, national militaries in Europe. So this is just a propaganda storm to cover up the real nitty gritty of what's going on. But thanks for the lead, Alex. Cheers.
Thoughts?
Well, somebody in the chat box has said that humanity is going into a very dangerous area. Well, it's not humanity. I'm going to say it's the people. We are silly enough to give the positions of power in government. What is going on with the British military? We don't know at the moment. Massive cuts at the same time that we're told that the Russians are a threat. That doesn't appear to make sense. And then we've got this route possibly to dotting small nuclear weapons around. Very dangerous. Public needs to know what's going on, I think.
But in the meantime, Alex, reports of Turkey continuing to provoke conflict.
The previous time I mentioned Turkey, it was that the opposition conservative parties, conservative in the Islamic sense, were saying if we win the elections, it's our sacred duty to invade the Greek islands, which would be NATO state against NATO state and also a route to World War III. This time we've got the latest in a series of incidents where the gas fields off oil and gas fields off the south of Cyprus, on the Greek side, the EU member state side of Cyprus, those concessions are being drilled by international ships, Italian in this case, and the Turks are sending their gunboats. Which is extremely worrying, of course. And at the same time, we've had a party rally in Kahramanmaraş, a town just north of the Syrian border, in which Erdogan saw a girl who'd been dolled up in soldier uniform, a 7-year-old who was in floods of tears, and hugged her to himself and said it would be an honor for you to die as a martyr to the fatherland. And this insulted liberal and Islamic conservative alike in Turkey as something really unprecedented for a leader to say, whether in the Islamic or the Western tradition that Turkey seems to straddle. You just don't talk to children like that, but perhaps he needs his cannon fodder that badly.
And in the meantime, a Foreign and Commonwealth Office leaker has apparently leaked a cable which reveals the West's strategy to disintegrate Syria, as the headline says here.
If it is an FCO leaker, and I think it probably is, it could have been a Russian intercept, but I doubt it. And the FCO leaker deserves a pat on the back, because this is, as with Catherine Gunn, my old colleague who sat on the next desk for me for a while, I thought she was a traitor till I understood better. This FCO leaker has pointed out something very unconstitutional against international law as well. So there's been a series of meetings in January between the British, French, Americans, the respective heads of Middle East diplomacy of each of those services, with a Jordanian and Saudi. So in this 5-way, they've got together in January. You can read about it on signsofthetimes.net, SOTT. The whole write-up is done by FARS, the Iranian agency. They've got a real interest to do this, of course, because the leader of this group, David Satterfield, the American running it, he called it the Small American Group, is telling his stooges, the Brits, French, Jordanians and Saudis, well, we need to stay in Syria, even though Assad or the government has won the ground war, because we don't want the Iranians involved in helping the country get back on its feet. And we have to corner the Russians with the old game of how much are you prepared to pay Russians to continue to support Assad, as they call it, support the Syrian government, we could better say. And there's talk here of telling the special representative of the UN Secretary General, in this case that's Mr. Stefan de Mistura, telling him by way of a non-paper, that's diplomatic speak for we have no remit, but we're going to tell you it anyway, tell him that there must be constitutional reform to keep the opposition boiling over and to keep the Russians backed up against the wall. So a whole leak there, which has gone through the Arab and Persian world very quickly. And I would say well done to the conscientious FCO person who's leaked that.
Okay, well, you mentioned Saudi Arabia there, and of course yesterday we had this big meeting over the Saudi visit. Well, yesterday was also Prime Minister's questions, and Jeremy Corbyn asked Theresa May. He said it cannot be right that the government is colluding in what the UN says is evidence of war crimes. Will the Prime Minister use our meeting today with the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia to halt the arms supplies and demand an immediate ceasefire in Yemen? Well, of course she didn't, and she said she wouldn't, but the Tory MPs, her backbenchers and so on, accused Jeremy Corbyn of carping, because this is going to damage the defence industry and put thousands of people out of work. It doesn't matter that thousands of people are dying in Yemen. That's called carping. But Theresa May has announced a new partnership with the Saudi Arabia. This is the inaugural meeting of the UK-Saudi Arabia Strategic Partnership Council with the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. This was a joint announcement at Downing Street yesterday. They've agreed a landmark ambition for around £65 billion of mutual trade and investment opportunities over the coming years, much of that dumped on Yemen without doubt, including direct investment in the UK and new Saudi public procurement and UK companies. These new investment and procurement opportunities will be spread across a range of sectors, including education, training and skills, financial, investment services, culture, entertainment, healthcare services and life sciences, and of course with Saudi's activities in Yemen. Well, for them that covers in financial investment services, culture and entertainment, doesn't it? That's what they do for culture and entertainment, is to bomb other countries. But anyway, this is fantastic, and as well as that, the UK and Saudi Arabia are building a long-term partnership to improve livelihoods, apparently. This is also links into the Department for International Development. So this is part of this partnership. Penny Mordaunt said, Global Britain is rightly recognised as an international leader when it comes to helping the most vulnerable, saving lives and tackling global challenges. She's talking about Yemen again, clearly. The Saudi Fund has a long record of investing in successful development projects around the world. We're sharing the best of British expertise, and our collective efforts will help create jobs and livelihoods to support those poorest people who stand on their own 2 feet, and in turn will help to boost global prosperity, which is in all our interests, by building critical infrastructure, after we've bombed it first, of course, for some of the world's poorest. Those lives are threatened by drought, disease and conflict. Together, we can make a bigger difference and ensure that everyday tasks like collecting drinking water are made much easier. But Alex, you wanted to draw attention to what Global Britain actually is.
This is a goldmine, Mike. Go to Martha Mackenzie. Her Twitter handle is mmackenzie74. She looks a bit younger than having been born in 74, but maybe that's just being kept in the style which Head of Government Relations salary at Save the Children allows. If you read from anti-clockwise from top left, she's actually quoting members of Parliament here. Here's a very clear example of David Ellis's coining party representatives coming true, right? Because this is across the parties. Top left, she's saying that George Freeman, a party representative of the Conservatives to the people of Norfolk, he said at this conference, this is Global Britain, the conference you mentioned before, Mike, with the I forget the acronym, but the group of NGOs and third sector people coming together.
Bond, you're talking about? This was the Bond conference, Alex?
The Bond conference, I believe it's the same one that Penny Mordaunt addressed. But anyway, right. It's called PX Global Britain. It may be a separate one. But anyway, George Freeman is saying our values are that's the British deep states, not our people, our biggest asset and critical to global security. We need a muscular, courageous foreign policy which is transformative. Mr. George Freeman also says at the conference it's utterly critical that this conference is taking place immediately after the big Europe speech. We must demonstrate Brexit isn't a retreat for the British deep state. At the bottom, we have Tom Tugendhat, another party representative of the Conservatives, this time to the people of Surrey, Tunbridge, I believe. He says, the rules liberate us all. And here our happy correspondent, Martha Mackenzie of Save the Children, is saying that this is a sentiment that makes my British heart sing. This is our rules-based international order again. Then we have Khalid Mahmood of the Labour Party saying we can't compete on infrastructure, trade, etc. with countries like China and the USA. Instead, we, that's the British deep state again, should make a virtue of our uniqueness. The British Council, which, by the way, got into trouble in Yekaterinburg in Russia under Stephen Kinnock's tenure for espionage, the British Council is revered. Let's embody this values culture-based approach. Finally, Mrs. Mackenzie, in her own words, summing up at the top right, says the common themes that all these party representatives and deep state people said was, 1, UK aid, that's DFID, the Department for International Development's money. UK aid is a critical part of Global Britain. 2, but it must be joined up with defence and diplomacy, that's the military and destabilisation again. And 3, it must be values-led, that's their values, of course, and transformative, Ryan's favourite word. And finally, the participants, in Mackenzie's words, said, it's finally time to let the public know this now that we've stitched it up.
Alex, one of the interesting things here is that since Penny Mordaunt took over as Secretary of State for Department for International Development, her task is clearly to rebrand that organisation in terms of the PR that they put about what they're doing. So whereas with her predecessor, And we had Boris Johnson, for example, heading over to Gaziantep and making films about what they're doing to train the White Helmets and the moderate rebels for Syria. Penny Mordaunt is trying to shift the narrative to suggest that the Department for International Development is only involved in genuine humanitarian aid, in helping people that are hungry, helping people with drinking water. But this tells a very different story.
Yes, indeed, Mike. And Penny Mordaunt was, I think, in the reserve. Was it not the Royal Navy Reserve? But she was an officer, perhaps the full Royal Navy for a while. And she placed a childish bet to see whether she could mention genitalia in her maiden speech in the Commons. That's the kind of person she is. But anyway, she is a military woman, although albeit for a short tenure, and I think the daughter of a military chap as well. And there she is being moved sideways into what used to be a very unglamorous department. We started off with Baroness Linda Chalker in the late Thatcher era, getting into trouble with the Kurds issue and various deep state entanglements to it. Then you had later on Tony Blair appointing Claire Short, a no-nonsense moral lady who seems to have caused no end of havoc by not understanding the deep state. And now we've got this very sophisticated operator, but also with the military background, because clearly DFID is controlling both the FCO and the MOD to some extent now with its priorities, because it is the closest refinement in one government department of what the deep state is, much as the US has had in the same era the rise of the Department of Homeland Security, I would say.
Yeah. Yes. Well, just to finish off on the Saudi issue, I was staggered last night to see, as the television was on in the background, and Saudi Arabia had actually commissioned some television ads to go on mainstream TV at peak time. According to Campaign here, they didn't stop with TV ads. They were putting billboards up around London, all to celebrate the visit of the Crown Prince. Clearly feeling a little bit sensitive about perhaps the bad press that they've had over Yemen, and thinking that this was going to change people's minds. I don't know. But anyway, the continuing close relationship between Saudi and the UK is something that I think we need to keep pressure on to try and prevent. But let's come on to this then. This is from the IPOC, which is the latest incarnation of the Independent Police Complaints Commission. And it's spectacular document. It's not a very good scan of it. It's clearly, they were clearly embarrassed about putting it up, but apparently they've been forced to put it up. It is a directive from Theresa May under the Investigatory Powers Act to the Investigatory Powers Commissioner's Office, and it instructs the Investigatory Powers Commissioner's Office to oversee the participation of MI5 agents in criminal activity. This, I think, is a pretty spectacular admission. We've known it's been going on, Alex, for quite some time, of course, but to have it in black and white, where Theresa May is saying that the Investigatory Powers Commission shall keep under review the applications by the Security Service and the guidelines on how agents who participate in criminality and the authorizations issued in accordance with them. So, it's a pretty spectacular admission that MI5 is operating unlawfully in certain conditions. We don't actually know the conditions that approval is given for them to act in an unlawful manner, because that's still being kept under wraps. But it must be a bit of a disappointment for the British government to have to admit this publicly.
Slowly and surely, the British government is being caught in a pincer movement in this investigatory issue, because the EU is going to increasing openness, and so is the US. There has been a case of statutory retrospective legalization of GCHQ behavior, which was outside the law, unlawful and illegal when it happened. Another example of that going on here, really. And the system still depends largely on self-reporting, although these commissioners are getting a bit more teeth. But unless we go the whole hog of the US and the EU and have judicial oversight of the operations of the intelligence services more robustly than we have now, it's still the government investigating the government.
Yeah. Okay, quick advertisement, Brian.
Yes, the NHS conference for the 12th of May, Dying for Good Health. And as we said yesterday, this has come about because over the last year in particular, we've had so much information come into the UK column talking about what is going on, what is really going on in the National Health Service, information coming in from doctors, nurses, even managers talking about encroaching chaos, all sorts of problems. And of course, many people who've had problems in the service with operations or failures. So we felt it was time for a conference to take a look at what's really going on. We've started to sell tickets already, just advertised yesterday, but already we've got some of those tickets taken. And on this slide that Mike's just put up on screen, if you go to the UK Column webpage and you look for the fourth box down on the right-hand side, you can click here to go to the tickets sales for that conference. I think this is going to be something very, very special. We will be announcing speakers shortly. These are all going to be speakers with deep knowledge of the NHS.
Okay, Alex, let's head over to the Netherlands then. Dutch MPs now want a green military.
This is one of those anti-war parties, Salima Belhaj involved, and again, one has to observe, that her forefathers weren't in the country, and now she's trying to tell the Ministry of Defence how to run the military operations. But anyway, she's got a lot of ridicule for this. There's Elsevier, the equivalent of The Economist, talking about her party, the Democrats 66, earning a great deal of ridicule for this suggestion of a green military. But then what she's talking about is the Ministry of Defence must innovate. She gave a long interview to Trouw, the fairly conservative Christian paper underneath there. She's talking about how we need to innovate, that the Dutch on operations should not be allowed to generate any electricity themselves, have any electricity that they haven't generated themselves. So even when they're in operations in the Sahara Desert in Mali, they need to generate it all with solar power. She says we need to make the military lead the way in meeting the Paris Accords targets. We can't have any fossil fuels supplied to base. Troops must grow their own food on location. That would be in the deserts of Afghanistan and Mali, I suppose. And we must appoint people, I suppose that would be friends of hers, as sustainability advisors to the Ministry of Defence. And military trucks will all have to be hybrids. And she also says we can't afford to resupply our Afghan bases from Uzbekistan because that would involve flying over Russian airspace, and the Russians are nasty. So it's a complete defanging of the Dutch military, of course. And again, we have to observe it goes in lockstep with what's happening to the British military.
Yeah.
Then if we pop over to Georgia.
Yes. Go ahead.
Yes, this is quite an event, really. 15 years on almost from the Rose Revolution, coming up this November, the 15th anniversary. A crowd of Georgians in Tbilisi, as reported here by Maxim Aristavi, who's with the Atlantic Council, which is basically a NATO neocon think tank. He reports this in horror, and other people on the thread say, "Oh, how anti-Semitic!" But there's nothing about it that's anti-Semitic. It's the usual slur. Ordinary Georgians of various shades come out and burn an effigy of Soros, and some of them were showing the pre-Saakashvili, pre-revolutionary flag of Georgia, which was the flag of Georgia from the breakup of the Soviet Union onwards. So it's almost as if the first country that got Soros has had enough of it and wants to go full circle.
If they've had enough of it and want to go full circle, what are the chances that they'll start to sidle back up to Russia again?
Oh, there's every chance of that. Some of the presidential contenders in the last 7 or 8 years have been men who've made their fortunes in Russia. Many Georgians have got relatives on both sides of the border, and it makes no sense at all for Georgia, even economically, to be cut off from Russian relations. Under Saakashvili, which was the whole point of the product of the Soros revolution, there weren't even diplomatic relations in the end after that war over South Ossetia. So any move from that position is going to be a move back to rapprochement with Russia, because by definition, because Georgia had moved off the page with Russian relations. But of course, anything will be presented as sidling up to Russia in a negative sense in the Western press.
Yes, absolutely. Now, we're getting tight for time, so just briefly on this, more countries going monetarily off-grid. We've got RT saying Caracas going crypto crazy, Venezuela set to launch second digital currency, Trustnode saying Switzerland to hold historic referendum on debt-free money. We've got crypto news, the Bank of Lithuania starts race for the first digital collector coin, and RT again, Iran bans the use of US dollar on trade. Are we seeing a trend building here?
Oh, very much so. And there's different vectors in each of these countries. A lot of it is to do with even keeping the dollar out of the denomination of trade. Many people might not be aware that if you order oil with a deal with no US involvement, the dollar has still been the currency in which the prices have been calculated, even if they're paid in another currency. But even that is getting taken off now. Even Zimbabwe has got more advanced real money than we have now after the terrible issues of 2008, 2009. They're having the Chinese make notes for them for the Reserve Bank, which actually contain gold. So there's a whole movement of much of the of Eastern Europe and the whole developing world off the debt-based Western bank-controlled economy.
Okay, now going back to Switzerland then for a second, this is from RT Deutsch. The Swiss nearly abolished their public broadcaster. It would be very nice if that was possible in this country, but what happened in Switzerland?
We had 72% last Sunday decide to keep the Swiss broadcaster, which has different names in the different languages. Here you can see a photograph from the western third of Switzerland, which is French-speaking. And there was an overwhelming vote to keep it because they see it as a way of keeping in touch with the German-speaking majority in the country. People have scrawled 450 on these posters because that's the cost in Swiss francs, more or less on a par with the pound and the euro. The cost per person per year of this tax, which is paid to basically a government set up collecting agency. It's obligatory. But it seems that the main reason the Swiss wanted to keep it is not because they love paying tax. They're in fact the only country in the developed world that set a time limit on the taxes governments can collect. But they wanted to keep it because otherwise the country would drift apart into its various zones. But of course, in other countries in the same mold, Sweden, Germany, Austria, where people have found BBC-style license fees becoming payable by general taxation in the last few years, this caused a lot of interest. So on the right, I had the Austrian paper Die Standard talking about this. Obviously, it's their neighbours, they're very interested. And what they pick up on is 2 days before the referendum, on the Friday of last week, the competition commissioner in Brussels, the Danish lady Margrethe Vestager, said in the middle of that small type there to a regional German paper, knowing that it would be read by the Swiss, of course, in the same language. She said, well, of course, we have public broadcasters funded by universal taxation because that creates the culture and politics that we wish to see. Again, this we not further defined the deep state at work, but the Swiss always set the way, and I think there will be, well, there already are great clamours in Austria, Germany, Sweden, the Netherlands to abolish these public broadcasters.
Well, I think that pretty much sums up the state of the BBC, of course, because they are absolutely presenting the story that the government in this country wants us to see. Let's remind everybody, Media on Trial in Leeds, 27th of May. Details on mediaontrial.uk. Tickets are available now. Get along if you possibly can. And then just a brief reminder of AV9. You will be speaking at that, Brian. Alex will be speaking at that as well on Friday the 4th to Monday the 7th of May 2018 at Horwood House Hotel near Milton Keynes. There's still tickets available for that. Get along if you possibly can. Now, where are we at next? European disbelief at Britain's rail infrastructure. Just 2 seconds on this, Alex, please.
Yes, people can find it easily by going to, I think it's called buzzsteam.com, but this is a well-written up description of the hellish journey that a southeastern rail commuter had in Lewisham. This is people out overseas. This is within the suburbs of South London that this happened. People stuck for hours peeing themselves on one of these trains because of a frozen rail up ahead. Europeans can't believe this. Granted, this happened on a conductor rail, which is hard to antifreeze. But in the Netherlands, for example, all the points have got electric warmers in them so that they don't freeze over. And yet here we've got rolling stock that's decades out of date. And because one of these trains conked out in the weather, the sardines packed in the train behind it were stuck for hours in atrocious conditions, all their muscles seized up. And he says, even though he's a healthy young man, he was in agony being pulled out of this train because of his legs seized up, and there were grannies urinating in the corner. It was atrocious, and really, the Europeans can't believe this is going on in Britain. But of course, the ownership of the rail is the problem.
I think the British can't believe what's going on in Britain, and we continue to see our critical infrastructure being shut down, Brian.
Absolutely. Of course, the railways destroyed. We could focus in on that. Perhaps we should. But we use this as a connector across because 500 jobs have just disappeared at Devonport Naval Base. I'm going to bring in David Ellis in just a couple of minutes on this. But interestingly, when you go on the internet and look at comments that people have posted, one of the people said it's like everything else, including Great Western Railways.
Yes.
So the public are picking up on this. So look at what Babcock says. We're cutting 500 jobs, but we're doing this because we need to be fit for all the new contracts we're going to get.
Right.
No. They're cutting because they're not going to get those contracts. UK Column has warned about this, and there's more cuts at Devonport to come. But have a look at this. This is the Forces News. Johnny Mercer, one of the Plymouth MPs, he feels let down that jobs have been axed. He's a little bit let down. This is what he said. Former Armour Captain and Plymouth MP Johnny Mercer has said he feels let down by the news that 500 jobs will be axed at Devonport Naval Base. Well, we can say he was more than feeling let down because we seem to have found him crying, well, literally, more or less. This is his Twitter page with a video clip, which is so appalling you need to watch it. A message for Plymouth at the end of a sad day for jobs in our city. It's not acceptable that we can be led up the garden path around jobs / a growing Royal Navy and have announcements like this with no warning. Commitments to our city only hardens on days like today. It was sob, he said in the video. He'd had a long day in Washington with the Defence Committee, but I'm so sorry for the families, the city, the individuals concerned. I'm acutely aware that each one is a pay packet going into a family in Plymouth. So he was literally crying. I didn't feel sorry for him at all, because basically this man, these are crocodile tears. This man has had repeated warnings. The UK Column, SDI's done it, repeatedly warned that there were going to be huge cuts in the armed forces to bring in EU military unification, and these were all arrogantly dismissed.
Before we bring David in, can I just ask, this seems to suggest, he seems to be saying in this tweet that we have a growing Royal Navy.
Yes.
But that's a lie.
Well, it's untrue. Let's say untrue. Maybe he doesn't know. Maybe he hasn't got the mental acumen to understand that the Royal Navy is being slaughtered. It's not growing, it's actually diminishing rapidly. HMS Ocean just sold off. I don't think Johnny Mercer has the mental acumen to understand what's happening around him. He's lost. He's a little boy lost in Westminster. Is that a bit cruel or unkind, David? I could say more.
Well, I tell you what is cruel is the course of action of losing 500 skilled engineering jobs there in Devonport. That's cruel. Mr. Mercer as a backbench MP there is totally expendable, as is all the other MPs down there. If they actually do any good, we would have saw some proper whiplash going on. They've not put it on the target. They haven't challenged. It's just all been a bit of a fudge and a whitewash, and they're going along with it. Now, if we'd have seen them withdraw the whip and then stand as an independent, I might have been encouraged, but that hasn't happened. So we've got a few things here to sort of talk about, obviously, is that the Tory party are in favour. We now know this because we've had a source tell us. The Tory party and Keeley, the Brexit MPs and ministers, are in favour of paying into the EU Defence Agency via the EU Investment Bank. So that's so, they're in favour of military union. And all of these cuts are part of the unification process. So they're as much military cuts as they are industry cuts, apart from the fact that obviously the compound detrimental impact industrially on Britain is far greater than the initial cut of the coalface military itself. That's a long-lasting effect. So for them to rebuke Mr. Corbyn and the front bench there is nonsense, because the job cuts have already happened. It wasn't 5 minutes ago BAE cut 2,000 jobs. That was not very long ago, and we could go on back into history, back to the 80s, and they're not reviewed. So, you know, Labour are not innocent in all this, because they've gone through it with the Jeff Hoon years and the George Robertson years, where, as I understand from a very good source, an admiral, the decision to shut Devonport was taken under Robertson's term. And all that's happened subsequent is that these backbench MPs have been playing party ping pong in order just to keep the seats, keep the public quiet and calm, whilst they get on with the work of unifying the military into the EU structure. So we're into the scenario here of all the eggs going into one basket up at Faslane. And, you know, this thing about Babcock talking about contracts, that's a load of nonsense, because the EU are going to control all the contracts. That's the whole point of EU military unification. It is the perfect closed loop control of money. Yep. It isn't so much about effective or operational or cohesive or innovative military. The concept is about stitching up all of the money in defence so that they can have a treasury and they can subject everyone in the EU zone to tax. That's what it's for. That's what it gets them. So I've got to say, I'm beyond annoyed with these MPs down there. To say they're dilatory would be an understatement. You know, they're just frankly useless. All of them. Streeter, just absolutely useless. They might as well not be there. They might as well be, you know, helping the opposition, because then they're not helping the people.
David, couldn't agree with you more. They're gutless, but at least the Plymouth Herald produced a picture which explained it. This was a screen capture. I haven't interfered with the Herald's page at all. This is an advert running into a video to do with Johnny Mercer, but there we are, a kitchen where something evil is being cooked up. And the label is Johnny Mercer leads a debate on the future of Plymouth's amphibious fleet. Well, the amphibious fleet is going to be destroyed, is being destroyed. You might as well put Johnny Mercer in a kitchen, because maybe he can cook a better burger than he can do anything to do with defence. But we've got immense arrogance in our senior military officers as well. You've come into contact, well, at least on the internet, with this gentleman, James, who seems to think he's part of the cruel sea with his mug of tea and his bushy beard. But he doesn't like knowing what the truth is, because we've told him what's coming with the cuts, what's coming with the British military. He's described me in particular as a zealot. What can you tell us about this man?
I'm just speechless with this. You know, I'm trying to sort of, you know, on the SDI Twitter feed, we're trying to get some sensible debate and raise awareness. You know, I mean, that's the whole point of this, is to get people to realise what's going on. And, you know, when you get an in-service officer coming along with this, you know, I mean, I understand, you know, he can't, you know, there's Official Secrets Act and so on and so forth. But I just don't get it. It's just not joined up. It's just not joined up. But I've seen, obviously, you're going to do the 2SL thing now. You're going to have him on as well.
Well, we will do that just very quickly to end the news. But let's come back to that one, if we can pop that one on screen there, Mike. So here is this man who's telling us we don't know what we're talking about, even though he's been provided with the evidence and he can't understand it. Why can't he understand it? Have a look at this tweet that he pushed out. I just found this one utterly astonishing. It says, if anyone speaks Russian and fancies giving the next generation of Russian advanced weapons stupid names, Bomsky McBombface, ? The Russian military official poll is open for your helpful suggestions. This is so immature that you have to question what is actually going on in this man's mind. Is this man suitable material to be in control of a warship? I don't think so. His arrogance and dismissive hand of evidence is one thing, but I find that tweet just shocking. I think that if lower ranks had pushed it out, they would actually find some form of censorship. We'll just show our viewers this one very quickly and we'll end on it. So this is back on the subject of Major General Charlie Strickland. This is the integration here with the Europeans. We need to be integrated with the Europeans because otherwise we can't fight pirates. David, 30 seconds. This is just sheer nonsense. We are not leaving the European Union. We are absolutely climbing into bed with them at every level, and it's just obvious to see.
Correct. Yeah, I've tried sort of explaining this. It's very difficult to do unless you can get people to sit still and sort of absorb it. understand this. Unifying all of the national militaries in Europe is a bureaucratic elephant. It is the biggest undertaking. It's a bigger undertaking than currency union. It makes currency union look easy, right? There is a freight train of bureaucracy to go through in order to do it. And every step that is taken currently to do with defence, with all of these would-be facades of bilateral agreements, because that's what they are just stepping stones to achieve the ultimate objective. And trying to get people to realise this is breathtaking, because EU NAVFOR was the baby steps initially to start blending the navies.
Yep. David?
All right, that's what its job's for. So, you can see there Mark Lancaster, he's reacted, I think, to a question from Andrew Rossingdale on this in the House and gone to EU NAVFOR because of the pressure that he's come under, not just from us, but all the other people campaigning. So, credit to them. But I understand the Lords External EU Subcommittee have been there as well. Do you want to put that slide up, Brian?
I haven't got any more on that. I think, David, we'll come back onto this subject. It is outrageous what's happening. The arrogance, the smokescreen, the obfuscation from both the Westminster end and from the Ministry of Defence, utterly breathtaking. We'll dig into this more. And of course, Alex pointing out the dangers of the deep state in Britain. We'll leave it there. Thank you to everybody who's joined us today. We will be back. Well, we'll be back at the same time tomorrow.
And you'll be in Scotland.
Yes, I'll be reporting UK column news from north of the border. See you then. Bye-bye.